Hello all. So this is going to be a very short video lecture. This is just meant to, you just read the appendix on reading short stories, and this video lecture is just meant to hit a few key points and provide a little bit of context. That's all. So one thing I want to point out is that although short stories, short fiction, um, in the actual construction of the language, they are most similar to novels. They actually have the most characteristically similar attributes to poetry. So, like poetry, the short story is a concentrated use of language dependent for its success on feeling and suggestion. You will notice that I'm giving you a bunch of random quotes that sort of have a thematic similarity here. That the short story is all about feeling, emotion, artistry, effect, and not so much about actually constructing a narrative, which is probably a little bit mind-boggling, but that's something that most people don't realize. Is that short stories are more about the emotional endpoint. They're more about the experience of the reader. Well, the experience of the reader is forefront for short stories. I mean, and also for other forms of fiction or poetry or all other forms of literature. But in the short story, you are very limited in what you're able to provide. So this maybe ridiculous analogy of a short story being a photograph is even more applicable now, in that when you look at a photograph based on what's in the background, facial expressions, body language, what's in the foreground, the setting, all of those things, does the center focus of the photograph have a red Solo cup in his hand? That tells you a lot. Maybe he's a college student at a college party. Um, a short story is a photograph where you're given the necessary bits of information, and then you have to extrapolate from there what is important. And once again, this all goes back to Poe, who was the first short story scholar. So, unity of effect. This is the principal underlying convention of short fiction. This is the rule that cannot be broken. In literature, you will find, in writing, creative writing, literature, you will find that there are very few rules that cannot be broken. There are a ton of guidelines, but only a handful of rules that you absolutely have to adhere to. This is one of those in short fiction. Unity of effect is maybe one of two or three absolutely unbreakable rules in short fiction. So, as described by Poe, our first short story scholar, or the world's first short story scholar, one of my favorite writers, unity of effect. It's almost physical, like a sensation. So there's a lot of psychological manipulation going into this. We are going to incorporate very powerful images, very powerful word choice in our short fiction. When I was in graduate school, just an interesting tangent. Most movies that you see, when they're adapted from a novel was just too big to cover in like a 2-hour movie. So most novels that are adapted into films are only like a third of the actual story. Ideally, the form that is best for a film is either the short story or the novella. Okay? So keep that in mind, because when you're watching a film, it's completely focused on the images, what can be seen. Most often you don't have a voiceover in a movie telling you that our protagonist feels sad. There's an image that shows that the protagonist feels sad. This is also, generally speaking, true of short stories. And a short story writer is most often trying to convey an emotional climax to the reader. So the best short stories have a sensation that feels almost physical. And to put this in simpler terms, one of my screenwriting professors in college said that he always said that he was a screenwriter by trade and then a professor. But he always said that your scenes in a screenplay and also in a novel, short story, whatever, they should feel like somebody's physically kicking you in the chest. So you should have a physical reaction to the emotions you feel from a short story. Okay. Poe also put forth this idea: total service to the effect. So everything in the story works towards this effect. The effect, as a definition in short fiction, relates to the purpose, that rhetorical purpose. Most often, this is an emotional response in the reader. You want the reader to feel something, to believe something. Some of the stories we're going to read there are a couple from teaching this class in the past that are going to make you feel just absolutely appalled and disgusted with humanity. There are a couple that are going to make you feel sad, a couple that are going to make you feel hopeful in the face of sadness. So everything has to be in service to the effect. When it comes to longer forms of writing, like the novel or a full-length screenplay, or even a memoir, a personal story about your life, autobiography, whatever, the ultimate end goal is usually some kind of cathartic realization, and everything works to service that. That's still an effect, but in a short story, it's usually more visceral, it's more emotional or ethical at the same time. What's important here that Poe put forth that is probably the most important part of this is that the story is words. This is Poe's words, not mine. So the story is the actual text. The effect is wordless. So the effect should be invisible. The reader should finish the story and feel something profound without having been told that they should feel this. So manipulation, subtlety, deceit, these are all crucially important in the short story. This has a lot to do with Hemingway took this idea and developed it into his iceberg theory, essentially, which we're going to talk about a lot, which is that, just to give you an introduction, Hemingway's iceberg theory is that a story is like an iceberg. The actual text on the page is what is above water, that 30% that is above water. The other 70% of the story is actually not written. It is what the reader interprets. It is this effect. It is the emotions the reader feels. So, if you've had me for English 100, you totally understand this. If not, we'll work on it. But your fluff does nothing. Bullshitting does nothing. It does not help at all. The ultimate goal of good writing is to say something insanely, unbelievably, cathartically profound and deep in as few words as possible. Length does not equal quality. Okay? And then James Joyce, who I don't particularly like as a writer, said that end moment, he called it the epiphany, which is the whatness of a thing. So that epiphany, that ending, is meant to make the reader understand what they're supposed to get out of this, why it's important, how it became important. It is this unnameable thing that is important, and the reader understands it. Okay? So, just to recap, short stories, novels generally tell a larger story, and depending on the writer and their purpose, they can be huge in scope. They could tell the story of a huge futuristic fantasy dystopian universe, or they could be something as simple. One of my favorite novels is about a college student who goes home over Christmas break, and hangs out and parties and does drugs with his friends and realizes that they're terrible people. The scope of what a novel can be is huge. Short stories, though, generally speaking, draw on the deep knowledge of human nature and how events shape human nature and how human nature shapes our perception of events to result in an epiphany, a cathartic moment, whatever. So once again, to reinforce, short stories are very limited in scope, but they tell the result is something very mind-blowing. So this goes back to the idea that every word, every punctuation mark, every paragraph indentation, it's all important. It is all to an effect. To be quite honest, within the publishing industry, depending on sort of what you write, if you write genre fiction, like a thriller novel, like The Da Vinci Code, these minute details are not very important. It's all about the plot. So you can get away with being sloppy. But then for more literary writers like myself who write stories that are totally focused on the psychology of experience, how experience changes you, my personal interests have to do with and this is a whole other long story that we'll get into when we get into the psychology of creative writing. But much of what I personally write has to do with somebody who feels trapped and then they rebel in an effort to find sort of freedom or a higher purpose. Okay? So in that sense, fiction, short stories, novels, whatever, in that more literary sense, everything is scrutinized to create in relation to this unity of effect. So this is where a lot of the student discrepancy comes into when it relating to literature classes, is that you could write a story that would make Stephen King proud, and you could write it like Stephen King, but that's not a literary story. I'm not saying it's a bad structure or a bad plot, but the execution is generally not regarded with the scrutiny that literary fiction is. Okay, so close reading of short stories. One of the things I want to drive into your head is to appreciate the artistry. You may not understand what the story is about, and that's fine. We're not necessarily focusing on that too much. We're focusing more on the nuances. You may read a line and you're like, I almost swore really badly there. You might be like, shit, that is a beautiful sentence. It's very poetic. I have no idea what it means, but I appreciate the artistry. That is a good thing. Okay? So within that aesthetic, craftsman, artistry principle, we then focus on how the story is written. So there are a lot of writers who are all style and no substance. They can say nothing with beautiful words, but they're not actually saying anything. So you have to find this balance. There's some great guidelines. I'm running out of time here. There's some great guidelines from the story, and it's right here on page 1044. Look at those. So a lot of what we're looking at is this relationship between the content, the execution of that content, and then how the writer's experience influenced those, but then how also the reader's experience influences how the reader interprets and receives that communication. So this all leads us to this idea that when you're looking at a photograph, you have to discern deeper meaning. Same thing is true for a short story. I have to end there. Great job.